a closed-door hearing that people in Washington only whisper about. The kind of thing that would never have a public camera angle, but somehow still feels like it has a soundtrack. In this imagined scene, Vice President J.D. Vance isn't there. The spotlight belongs to the House Committee on Ethics, and a question that sounds simple until the math starts arguing back. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the investigator says, let's talk about a home purchase on June 15, 2025. The claim on the table is blunt. A $4.2 million property in Wesley Heights, Washington, D.C., paid in cash, no mortgage, no financing, just a clean close like someone dropped a suitcase on the settlement desk. And if you've lived in American politics long enough, you know the moment someone says cash and politician in the same sentence, half the room stops breathing and the other half starts calculating. Now, to be clear, what follows is commentary built around a hypothetical scenario, the kind of political thought experiment that people use to talk about incentives, branding, and the soft spots in the system. It's not a verdict, it's not a declaration of guilt, and it's not me telling you what did happen, because none of us were in that room, and real life is usually messier than any script. But the reason these stories travel is that they're plausible enough to make your brain itch, and Washington runs on that itch. AOC in this imagined room wears the kind of outfit that says, "I'm here to be taken seriously." Burgundy blazer, black top, gold hoops, red lipstick, the aesthetic that made her an icon to supporters and an obsession to critics. She's flanked by high-powered counsel, and the irony practically signs itself. The congresswoman who built a brand on working-class authenticity sitting between attorneys whose hourly rates could pay a month's rent in the Bronx. Across from her sits Dan Bongino in the role people love to cast him in. The hard-eyed investigator. The guy who doesn't raise his voice because he thinks raised voices are what you use when you don't have receipts. In reality, titles and roles shift over time, and public service is full of job changes. So treat this as a narrative device, not a fact claim. Next to him, Special Agent Jennifer Martinez is described as the quiet kind of prepared, laptop open, finger on the file. The type who lives inside spreadsheets until the truth gets tired and falls out. Two thick binders sit on the table like props in a courtroom drama. But in our scenario, they symbolize something more mundane and more terrifying: documentation. Because the scariest thing you can put in front of a political brand is not an insult, it's arithmetic. The opening punch isn't ideological, it's basic. Congressional salary numbers that any intern can pull. If you assume AOC's salary is around $174,000 a year, and you stack up several years of it, you can get into seven figures before taxes, sure, but cash buying a $4.2 million home is where the math starts asking follow-ups. The investigator lays out the contrast the way prosecutors do. Even if someone saved aggressively, even if they lived cheaply, even if they somehow avoided every major expense that real humans have, how does the gap close? He doesn't say crime, because in a careful world, you don't say that unless you can prove it. And proving it is not a vibes-based exercise. He says, where did the other money come from? And he lets the silence do what silence does when it's put under fluorescent lights. In this imagined hearing, AOC's first instinct is the instinct of modern politics. Frame the question as an attack, and yourself as the target. She points to harassment, to bias, to the endless appetite some people have for taking her down. And anyone who's watched American media cycles knows that instinct isn't random. It's been rewarded 1,000 times. But the investigator doesn't argue about motives. He argues about transaction timing, because timing is the one witness that doesn't get nervous. He slides copies of bank activity across the table, as if paper can carry weight, and in politics it can. 3 transfers are highlighted, clustered inside a few days, and clustered transfers always look like coordination, even when they're innocent. In the story, the senders are LLCs with patriotic-sounding, movement-sounding names, the kind of names that could mean anything and therefore mean nothing. One is listed as Progressive Future Fund, another as Grassroots Action Network, another as Democratic Advancement Coalition. And if those sound like they were engineered to be unsearchable, that's part of why people distrust the system. The investigator emphasizes a pattern. Money arrives, then a property closes. Then the question becomes whether the money was meant for something public-facing or something personal. And because we're being careful, we frame it as a question, not an accusation. Were these political support funds, charitable intent funds, consulting funds, or something else entirely? If you can't answer that cleanly, you don't just have a legal problem, you have a narrative problem. And AOC is a politician who understands narratives better than most. The room, in the imagined version, reacts the way rooms react when big numbers get said out loud. Some members lean back like they've just been told their flight is delayed. Others lean forward like they've been handed a plot twist. A Republican member, Virginia Fox is a name often associated with sharp oversight questions, asks the obvious. Who's behind those LLCs, and why do they exist? The investigator answers with more structure than heat, describing how some states, especially Delaware, are friendly to corporate anonymity, which is legal in many circumstances and suspicious in others. He doesn't claim that anonymity equals wrongdoing. He points out that anonymity makes accountability harder, which is the kind of statement nobody can really argue with. Then the narrative goes where modern political mythologies always go: the donor ecosystem. In this fictionalized walkthrough, Democracy Alliance shows up as a hub, and Open Society Foundations is referenced as a familiar brand name in political arguments about billionaire influence. Here's where the responsible version of the story uses conditional language and rhetorical questions instead of declarations. If money moved through networks like this, how would anyone prove intent, and who benefits from the complexity? If 3 LLCs feed one newly formed entity, and that entity buys a home, is that movement building, a poorly structured project, or just optics that look terrible? And if you're AOC, a politician who built her rise on calling out dark money, how do you survive a storyline where dark money is even adjacent to your personal life? This is the part where satire practically writes itself, because American politics is a place where tax the rich can end up sitting in the same paragraph as wine cellar. In the imagined slideshow, there are photos of a home theater, a gourmet kitchen, manicured grounds, and all the visual shorthand that says elite neighborhood. Now, homes can be misrepresented, listings can be cherry-picked, and people can exaggerate features. So a careful narrator says, assume the photos are accurate for the sake of argument, and ask what the symbolism does. AOC's brand is built on being the anti-club, the person who storms the velvet rope culture instead of joining it. So the question isn't, did she do X? It's, if the public believes she did X, how does she put that genie back in the bottle? The story then widens to include Riley Roberts, because political scandals love a secondary character who turns into a main character overnight. In this scenario, the investigator describes a consulting company, Digital Outreach Strategies, and points to a suspiciously narrow client list. The rhetorical frame matters here. Lots of small consultancies have tiny footprints. Lots of political work is informal, and not every deliverable lives in a neat folder labeled deliverables. But politics is the one industry where being informal can look like being shady, because money is always nearby, and suspicion is always hungry. So the investigator asks not, is it fake, but what is the work? Where is the work? And why is the compensation so large relative to what we can observe? Numbers get repeated because repetition is how humans decide what matters. In the narrative, the total cited is $1 million over several years, a figure big enough to make headlines, but not so big that people assume it's automatically impossible. The story claims interviews where staffers can't point to concrete deliverables, which, again, could mean nothing, could mean record-keeping is sloppy, or could mean something else. Your conclusion depends on what you already think about these people. A careful political commentator doesn't tell the audience what to think. They ask why the system makes it so hard to verify. And the dark joke is that, in politics, it's hard to quantify is sometimes a real explanation and sometimes a convenient fog machine. At this point, the imagined hearing becomes less about one congresswoman and more about the culture that turns politicians into influencer brands. AOC isn't famous because she filled potholes. She's famous because she mastered the modern attention economy. She can cut a clip, frame a fight, and command the conversation in a way that makes older politicians look like they're still mailing newsletters. That's power, but it's also vulnerability. Because a brand is a promise, and the moment the promise looks inconsistent, the brand becomes a target. So the investigator, in this scenario, does what investigators do. He puts her public statements beside the alleged financial pattern and lets the contradiction speak first. The storyline pulls up past moments like the Met Gala appearance, because politics loves a symbol, and the Met Gala is basically a symbol factory. The careful version doesn't insist on dollar amounts as proven fact. It uses estimates and questions because fashion valuations can be slippery and ethics rules can be interpreted through process. Still, the rhetorical question lands. If you're attending ultra-exclusive events while presenting yourself as the sworn enemy of elite culture, what do you owe your voters in terms of transparency? If your defense is it's advocacy, then what's the boundary between advocacy and lifestyle and who gets to draw it? And if your defense is it was loaned, then why do people still feel like the loan is a perk ordinary constituents will never touch? The imagined investigator keeps the tone dry because dryness is the trick. Dryness makes it feel like just facts, even when a story is doing what stories do, shaping how you feel. He references disclosures, reporting thresholds, and the kind of procedural language that makes people's eyes glaze over until they realize procedure is how accountability is supposed to work. A Democrat like Jamie Raskin, in this narrative, tries to open a door that doesn't automatically indict. Could there be a foundation plan, a future project, a misunderstood vehicle? And the investigator closes that door by pointing to timelines, because timelines are what you use when motives are debatable, but sequences are not. If the entity was formed in late May, funded in early June, and used in mid-June for a home purchase, the audience naturally asks what else it could have been for. Maybe it was a rushed structure for something legitimate. Maybe the paperwork lagged. Maybe the intent was one thing and the outcome became another. Or maybe, the cynical viewer says, it looks like a classic Washington move. Create a box, pour money into it, then dare anyone to prove what the money really was. The point is not to convict anyone in the court of public opinion. The point is to show how the court of public opinion works. And it works on optics, patterns, and the nagging sense that the people yelling corruption the loudest sometimes forget to lock their own doors. There's a reason the narrative emphasizes no mortgage, because mortgages are ordinary, and ordinary is politically defensible. A mortgage says, I got approved, I'm paying over time, I'm like you but with better credit. Cash says, I had a mountain of liquidity, and mountains of liquidity in politics always invite the same question. From where? Even wealthy politicians usually borrow because borrowing is normal, and normal is how you hide in plain sight. So the rhetorical question becomes, if you wanted to avoid scrutiny, would you really choose the least normal option possible? Or did you simply believe the narrative shield was strong enough to handle it? Now the story turns into what it really is: a clash between two types of power. AOC's power is cultural and digital. She moves crowds, she frames debates, she weaponizes the meme economy. The investigator's power is institutional and procedural. He moves documents, subpoenas, and committee votes. When those two collide, you get the kind of drama that people binge because it feels like, finally, accountability, no matter which side they're on. And here's the sharp part. Accountability is usually slow, and drama is usually fast. So any story that makes accountability feel cinematic is going to spread like wildfire. In the imagined exchange, AOC's attorneys, Mark Elias is frequently invoked in political circles as a high-profile Democratic lawyer, step in with the language lawyers use when stakes rise. They start hinting at constitutional protections, not because it proves anything either way, but because it signals risk. The committee chair, Michael Guest, is a plausible pick for a stern gavel in a made-for-streaming scenario, pushes for answers, because committees hate being treated like theater, even when they're acting in one. The investigator asks yes or no questions, and counsel responds with counsel's favorite phrase, the one that sounds like a door shutting without slamming it. The audience, in this narrative, reacts the way audiences always react. Some see that refusal as proof of guilt, others see it as a smart move in an unfair environment, and almost nobody agrees on what it means. That's the whole trick of American scandal culture. The same gesture can be read as cowardice or prudence, depending on who's watching. If you already dislike AOC, you hear refusal and think, caught. If you already support her, you hear refusal and think, they're setting a trap. And if you're a normal person with a job and a commute, you hear refusal and think, I don't know what happened, but I know this is going to be on every screen tonight. So the story, to keep its grip, doesn't declare her guilty. It declares the moment culturally radioactive. Because the real currency here is not a conviction, it's a fracture in trust. From there, the narrative's stakes rise into the what happens next zone, where speculation can turn into misinformation if you're not careful. So we keep it framed as hypothetical. If a committee referred a case, if agencies reviewed filings, if press leaks happened, what would the public do with that? The public would do what it always does: compress complexity into a meme, reduce nuance to a slogan, and pick the interpretation that flatters their side. The right would call it proof that the socialist influencer was always in it for herself. The left would call it weaponized oversight, selective outrage, and proof that charisma threatens entrenched power. But the most interesting angle isn't left versus right, it's brand versus reality. AOC's brand is, I'm the bartender who fought the machine, and that brand works because it's a story Americans understand. We love the scrappy underdog who embarrasses the insiders, and we hate the insiders partly because we suspect the insiders are all playing the same game. So if an underdog becomes insider-coded, mansions, elite parties, expensive counsel, supporters feel betrayed even if there's a benign explanation. That's why perception matters so much in politics. You can survive policy fights, you can survive gaffes, you can survive nasty headlines, but you can't easily survive the sense that you were selling authenticity you couldn't cash. And the funniest, saddest part is that the audience doesn't need proof beyond a reasonable doubt to change how they feel. They need a storyline that feels coherent and a few visuals that make the coherence pop. Put a photo of AOC at the Met Gala next to a photo of a fancy property, and suddenly millions of people feel like they get it. That's not justice, but it's how modern judgment works, and everybody in Washington understands it. So the smart political question is, why would any movement-based politician allow themselves to be put in a position where those visuals can exist at all? In our scenario, the investigator keeps returning to one phrase: the numbers don't add up, because that's the phrase that survives cross-examination. He doesn't need to call anyone a criminal to make the audience uncomfortable. He just needs to show a mismatch and let the viewer's imagination do the rest. He suggests areas that could warrant review: disclosures, gifts, campaign spending, without claiming a final conclusion, because final conclusions belong to processes, not monologues. AOC responds with moral language: who she fights for, what she stands for, because moral language is her home field. The investigator responds with procedural language: what was paid, when it was paid, where it went, because procedural language is the one thing moral language can't outvote. At this point, the story reaches its climax, not with a shouting match, but with a kind of slow public unraveling. Imagine leaks hitting the press in fragments, each fragment not enough to prove anything alone, but enough to keep the machine running for days. Ethics panel reviews AOC finances, then questions raised about LLC transfers, then Riley Roberts consulting payments scrutinized, and the story becomes a rolling thunderclap. The audience doesn't wait for the ending. The audience starts writing the ending the moment the first headline appears. And AOC, the queen of rapid response politics, suddenly finds herself fighting a format she can't fully control, because documents don't respond to tweets the way pundits do. If she counters with indignation, critics call it deflection. If she counters with details, critics say the details are cherry-picked. If she stays quiet, critics say silence is admission. That's the trap of scandal in the social media era. Every move becomes evidence to someone. So the careful commentator doesn't tell you what's true. They tell you what's predictable. And what's predictable is that once a narrative like this starts, it's almost impossible to stop without an independent, trusted process that most Americans no longer believe exists. Now step back and ask the bigger, more uncomfortable questions, the ones that make this story sticky, even if it's purely hypothetical. Why do politicians build brands that require them to live like monks in order to remain believable? Why do we demand authenticity and then punish people for having any access to elite spaces, even when that access might be part of their job? Why do donor networks exist in forms that make normal people feel like everything is a shell game, even when some of it is legal compliance and strategic structuring? And why does every side assume the worst about the other side's money, while hand-waving about their own team's gray areas? If you're a supporter of AOC, you might hear this scenario and think it's a caricature designed to smear her, and you wouldn't be crazy to worry about that. If you're a critic of AOC, you might hear it and think it's the overdue reckoning of a politician you believe built fame on performance, and you wouldn't be alone. If you're politically exhausted, you might hear it and think, of course it's an LLC, because in America, the villain in every money story is always an acronym. That's why the safest and smartest way to treat stories like this is not to sprint to conclusions, but to insist on clarity. What is verified? What is alleged? What is estimated? And what is purely narrative flourish? Because the most toxic thing in politics isn't ideology, it's ambiguity that powerful people can exploit. So here's the close, still in the voice of skeptical American commentary, still refusing to convict anyone with a keyboard. If a public figure spends years denouncing billionaire influence, then even the appearance of billionaire-adjacent money touching their personal life becomes a credibility crisis. If a movement leader builds their identity on being of the people, then elite-coded visuals become political landmines whether or not they're fair. If the system allows money to travel through vehicles that feel intentionally opaque, then every opaque transfer becomes a Rorschach test for distrust. And if the public has learned anything in the last decade, it's that the truth doesn't always arrive in one clean press conference. Sometimes it arrives in drips, sometimes it arrives in court filings, and sometimes it never arrives in a way that convinces everyone. In that environment, AOC's real challenge, whether any specific allegation is true or not, is that she's the rare politician who can't survive on "everyone does it." Her supporters don't follow her because she's competent. They follow her because she's supposedly different. Her critics don't attack her because she's ineffective. They attack her because she's symbolically powerful. So any storyline that turns her from symbol of authenticity into symbol of hypocrisy is a political wildfire, and wildfires don't care who started the spark. The only thing that stops them is transparency that feels complete. And in modern American politics, feels complete is a higher bar than is complete. And that's where the imagined story keeps breathing. Because in Washington, nothing really ends when the gavel comes down. Even after a hearing adjourns, even after statements are issued and talking points circulate, the real action moves into the gray space between perception and proof. Supporters start parsing every word for bias, every question for motive, every pause for subtext, while critics replay the same clips hunting for contradictions. Cable panels argue about process versus politics, about whether scrutiny itself has become a weapon, or whether outrage is just accountability with better lighting. And somewhere underneath all of that noise sits the same unresolved question that refuses to go away. Why does modern political success seem to require both radical rhetoric and elite proximity at the same time? In this hypothetical aftermath, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez does what any seasoned media figure would do and shifts the frame. She talks about values, about intention, about the difference between personal life and public mission, about how quickly narratives harden before facts can catch up. She reminds people that movements are messy, that funding ecosystems are complicated, that not every structure looks clean from the outside. Her allies emphasize her voting record, her consistency on policy, the tangible outcomes she's fought for in housing, labor, and climate debates. They ask, sometimes sincerely, and sometimes strategically, whether the same microscope is ever pointed this closely at politicians whose rhetoric flatters wealth instead of challenging it. Critics, meanwhile, don't need a verdict to feel validated. They argue that leaders who build careers on moral clarity invite moral scrutiny, and that scrutiny doesn't have to wait for a courtroom to matter politically. They say trust isn't just about legality, it's about alignment between message and lifestyle, between language and lived reality. They point out that transparency isn't a punishment. It's the price of branding yourself as the anti-establishment alternative. And they ask, often with a hint of sarcasm, whether movement politics was ever as grassroots as it was marketed to be. What makes the whole scenario sticky isn't any single allegation. It's the accumulation of unanswered why questions. Why use complex financial vehicles when simplicity would avoid suspicion? Why allow personal and political finances to blur in ways that invite misinterpretation? Why underestimate how aggressively opponents will weaponize even the appearance of contradiction? And why, in an era where every receipt eventually becomes a screenshot, assume that narrative control alone is enough to outrun documentation? The broader takeaway, if there is one, isn't about one politician so much as a generation of them. Social media native lawmakers operate in a world where authenticity is currency, And currency depreciates fast when confidence cracks. They're rewarded for being bold, viral, and morally absolute. But those same traits leave little room for nuance when life gets complicated. The public doesn't expect perfection, but it does expect coherence. And coherence is fragile when money, influence, and image intersect. That tension isn't unique to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It's just more visible around her because she's been so visible from the start. So the story, as a piece of political commentary, never really resolves. It lingers as a cautionary tale about incentives, about how the system quietly pushes reformers toward the very structures they criticize. It raises uncomfortable questions about whether it's possible to fight elite power without, at some point, brushing up against it. It forces viewers to confront their own biases, to ask whether they'd interpret the same facts differently if the name attached were someone they liked more or less. And it leaves behind a familiar American conclusion that isn't satisfying, but feels honest. In politics, the truth is rarely just what happened. It's what people believe happened once the story takes hold. By the time the dust settles in this imagined saga, what remains isn't a clean moral or a courtroom-style resolution, but a mirror held up to the audience itself. Some viewers walk away convinced the entire episode proves what they've always believed about politics as performance art wrapped in moral language. Others leave just as convinced that this is another example of how easily suspicion can be amplified into narrative, especially when the target is polarizing and highly visible. Most people land somewhere in the middle, uneasy not because they know what's true, but because they can't tell where confidence ends and certainty begins. That discomfort is the real ending, because discomfort is what keeps these stories alive long after the last clip stops trending. In that sense, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez becomes less a character and more a symbol in the closing moments of this commentary. She represents the collision between idealism and infrastructure, between anti-elite messaging and the realities of operating inside elite systems. Her rise was powered by a promise that politics could look different, sound different, feel more human and less transactional. When questions arise that appear to blur that promise, even without definitive answers, the emotional reaction is inevitable. People don't just feel confused. They feel personally implicated, as if their own judgment is being quietly cross-examined. The imagined investigators in this story fade into the background at the end, not because their questions stop mattering, but because the spotlight shifts. The focus moves away from binders and timelines and onto a larger issue that no committee can subpoena. How much contradiction will voters tolerate from leaders who trade in moral clarity? At what point does complexity start sounding like convenience, even if no line has been formally crossed? And why do we demand radical transparency from some figures while accepting comfortable opacity from others? What's striking is how quickly the conversation stops being about policy altogether. Housing affordability, healthcare, wages, climate, labor rights, all the issues that originally fueled AOC's popularity drift to the margins. Instead, the debate centers on optics, intent, lifestyle, and tone, the currency of modern political judgment. That shift says less about her and more about the ecosystem that rewards conflict over substance. Once a story like this takes hold, policy positions become footnotes to personality and perception. There's also a quieter lesson embedded here, one that doesn't fit neatly into partisan talking points. Movements that define themselves by moral opposition create expectations that are almost impossible to satisfy indefinitely. If you campaign against the rich, any whiff of comfort becomes suspicious. If you condemn dark money, any financial structure that isn't instantly legible becomes a liability. The higher the moral ground, the thinner the margin for error, real or perceived. For supporters, the ending feels unresolved and frustrating. They may argue that scrutiny without proven wrongdoing is just another form of selective outrage. They may point out that powerful interests have every incentive to discredit voices that challenge entrenched systems. They may ask why structural inequality is treated as abstract, until a progressive figure becomes personally successful. Those questions aren't irrational, and they don't disappear just because critics feel vindicated. For critics, the ending feels like a confirmation of long-held skepticism. They see the scenario as evidence that branding can mask ordinary political ambition. They argue that anyone who monetizes authenticity should expect aggressive questioning when the numbers look uncomfortable. They claim the issue isn't ideology, it's integrity, and integrity must withstand scrutiny without relying on narrative shields. That certainty, too, becomes part of the story, shaping how future controversies will be interpreted. And for everyone else, the ending lands as a kind of warning label. American politics now runs on images, alignment, and trust, faster than it runs on facts. Once trust is strained, even hypothetically, no explanation ever feels complete enough to fully restore it. Every clarification is heard through the filter of prior belief, every denial weighed against a screenshot. The process doesn't reward patience, it rewards decisiveness, even when decisiveness outpaces truth. So the final note of this imagined commentary isn't a verdict, it's a pause. A pause to ask whether the way we consume political narratives leaves room for complexity at all. A pause to consider how easily questions become conclusions once they fit a satisfying storyline. A pause to recognize that in an attention-driven system, the appearance of contradiction can be as damaging as contradiction itself. And a pause to wonder how many future leaders will learn to speak less in absolutes, knowing how mercilessly absolutes can be turned against them. In the end, the most enduring takeaway isn't about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as a person, but about the fragile bargain between public figures and the public. When leaders offer authenticity as their defining feature, authenticity becomes the standard by which everything else is measured. When that standard feels shaken, even slightly, the response is rarely proportional or restrained. It becomes emotional, symbolic, and deeply personal for people who thought they knew what they were supporting. That's the real power and the real risk of modern political branding. And that's where the story closes, not with certainty, but with a question that lingers long after the commentary ends. Can American politics sustain figures who speak in moral absolutes without eventually turning those absolutes into traps? Can movements survive the inevitable tension between ideals and infrastructure? And can audiences learn to sit with ambiguity long enough to demand clarity without demanding spectacle? Those questions don't belong to one hearing, one figure, or one party. They belong to the era itself.